Merci Laurie, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui. Donc, the studio of Homer Ransford Watson, and we see Watson here in a photograph by Edmond Dionnet, one of several photographs of artists that Dionnet made at the turn of the century. Homer Watson's studio has been in almost continual use since Watson established it in 1882. Its initial purpose was, of course, to be a working studio, but it was subsequently utilized as a sales room and then as an art school teaching facility, and most recently as a museum exhibition space. So today I'll be looking at the design and decoration of the studio, as well as at the different functions that it has served over its 141-year lifetime. Homer Watson was born in 1855 in Doon, an Ontario village on the Grand River south of Kitchener. Doon had been founded in 1834, just 21 years before Watson was born there. By the time he was in his mid-teens, it had a population of only 150 people, but today it's part of the sprawling city of Kitchener, which is in turn part of the largest city of Kitchener-Waterloo. Watson was above all a landscape painter, of course, mostly self-taught, with a deep and lifelong commitment to portraying Doon and its surrounding landscapes. His paintings made him one of the most respected figures in Canadian art from the 1880s until the First World War. From 1907 to 1913, he served as the first president of the Canadian Art Club, the private exhibiting society dedicated to promoting contemporary Canadian art, and that included James Wilson Maurice amongst its members. He also held key administrative positions in the much more conservative Royal Canadian Academy of Arts, first as vice president from 1914 to 1918, and then as president from 1918 until 1922. The first major exhibition in which Watson participated was the Ontario Society of Artists' 1878 annual show, but much more crucial to his career was the inclusion of his painting, The Pioneer Mill, in the inaugural exhibition of the Canadian Academy of Arts, soon to be renamed the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts, in 1880, when he was just 25. Canada's Governor-General, the Marquis of Lorne, purchased the Pioneer Mill as a gift for Queen Victoria, the mother of Lorne's wife, Princess Louise, and that purchase was crucial. It enabled Watson to marry his fiancée, Roxana Bechtel, and to move out of the family home and into the upper section of a house that had been constructed for Adam Ferry, a mill owner who was the wealthiest of Doon's founders. The Ferry house had been built 30 years earlier in something resembling vaguely a Scottish Gothic style, probably by Adam Ferry's brother, Robert, on a large tract of land owned by Adam. Watson was then able to buy the entire house in 1882, the next year, at which point he transformed one of the ground floor rooms into a painting studio. By 1893, 11 years later, his career was in full bloom, and he used his now comfortable income to build a studio extension with clerestory windows onto the original house. So here we have the original house built for Adam Ferry, and here is the extension that was built onto it. And you can just see the edge of it there with the clerestory windows. Watson personalized both the original studio and its 1893 extension by decorating them with a painted frieze that still runs along the full length of the walls, just below the ceiling. The frieze in the original studio is 48 centimeters high and 5,000 centimeters long, and the section in the 1893 extension is 40 centimeters high and 6,814 centimeters long. The total frieze is therefore almost 400 feet in length. It is a tribute to 13 17th, 18th, and 19th century European painters whom Watson particularly admired. They were Claude Lorrain, Salvador Rosa, Jacob von Ruysdael, Meindert Hobbema, Thomas Gainsborough, John Constable, J.M.W. Turner, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, Narcisse Diaz de la Peña, Jean-François Millet, Charles-François Daubigny, Théodore Rousseau, and Jules Bastien Lepage. Watson had first seen work by these artists only a very few years earlier during a 3-year visit to Britain in the late 1880s, and then on a second, shorter trip in 1891. He later singled out 11 of these artists for praise in a lecture that he delivered at the University of Toronto in 1900, titled The Methods of Some Great Landscape Painters. Not a very original title, but there we are. Each artist's name in the frieze is painted in uppercase letters and is accompanied by one or two small landscape paintings created by Watson in that artist's style. So here we see the two paintings associated with Daubigny. Strangely enough, the frieze makes no reference at all to the work of American artists such as George Inness or members of the Hudson River School, although Watson had almost certainly seen their work already during a multi-month visit he made to New York State in the second half of the 1870s. And although many of his own landscape paintings from the 1870s and 80s were strongly influenced by the American artists' sweeping vistas and dramatic atmospheric effects, this is especially true of George Inness. You can really see his impact on Watson's work. On the other hand, Watson's inclusion of 5 Barbizon artists in the frieze reflected the fact that he shared their belief that a sine qua non of successful landscape artists was a profound emotional and psychological connection to the locales where they worked. That certainly was an accurate description of Watson's relationship with Doon, which he deeply loved. Aside from generally brief visits to other parts of Canada, the United States, and Northern Europe, he lived in Doon his entire life and was so closely associated with the village that he was popularly known as the Hermit of Doon. Indeed, his landscapes have often been credited, as was done in the 1963 National Gallery of Canada retrospective exhibition, as being amongst the earliest portrayals of Canadian scenery that are not visually reminiscent of European landscape tradition. Watson consistently argued that any landscape painter's richest and most meaningful work was accomplished when, as he phrased it, quote, "Every familiar scene is hallowed with a glamour which is given a charm that the attractions of a strange land can never give, and the artist paints it with his soul." In that regard, the prominence of the Barbizon artists in Watson's studio frieze makes complete sense, since their deep attachment to the inhabitants of the village of Barbizon and to the neighboring forest of Fontainebleau paralleled Watson's deep commitment to the landscape in and around the village of Doon and to the people whose livelihoods were intimately linked to those landscapes. Watson included John Constable in his studio frieze for much the same reason, and here are the two paintings that he did in Constable's style. Oscar Wilde, during his 1882 year-long lecture tour of North America, had actually seen one of Watson's paintings at that year's Ontario Society of Artists exhibition, and he publicly described Watson both in a lecture and in print as, quote, Barbizon without ever having seen Barbizon, and as, quote, the Canadian Constable. Those credentials cemented Watson's popularity amongst prominent Canadian collectors, especially in Montreal, where the Barbizon school had a major following. However, as the years went by, Watson came to resent Wilde's comparisons because at the time of Wilde's praise, he, Watson, had never actually seen a Constable or any Barbizon painting in person. And in that sense, Watson's studio frieze was more than just the homage to prominent European landscape painters that it's usually assumed to be. Instead, I propose that it's important to remember that the frieze features original Watson images in the style of, but not copied from, all 13 of the artists named in the frieze. Given his growing resentment of Wilde, it seems reasonable to conclude that Watson, in addition to paying homage, was staking a claim for his own originality in reinterpreting those artists' work. As he wrote to Group of Seven member Arthur Lismer many years later, he disliked being cast as a follower of Constable and insisted that the reason for the similarities between their work was, quote, the outgrowth of a set of conditions. My environment was to a certain extent the same as his, hence the coincidence. For my love has always been where cultivation went on to furnish a living to people who came out of the pioneer stage for a more refined rural life. He argued that while it was true that he made his painting The Floodgate as a conscious attempt to echo Constable's 1824 painting, The Lock, or L'Écluse, he did this as a demonstration that he was fully capable of taking a stereotypical Constable subject and reinterpreting it within a specifically Canadian context. In his words, quote, "After I saw The Lock of Constable, I said, 'Hang it, I will paint a subject Constable would have delighted to paint, and that was my grandfather's mill pond, so that my floodgate came into being. Just some fun for me in a way for calling me a follower of Constable. I thought, let him have it, for I have never in my heart felt I needed to follow any man.'" Both of these paintings depict properties owned and loved by the artists and their families, but that emotional attachment is the limit of their similarity, really. Constable's The Lock is a sunny scene that shows a workman opening a lock near a mill owned by Constable's father in order to allow a large barge boat to progress peacefully along the river Stour. Watson's The Floodgate, on the other hand, shows a workman struggling during a violent storm to close a gate to prevent the storm water from flooding his grandfather's mill pond. In other words, Watson's painting borrows a familiar Constable's theme, and it borrows Constable's love of his local landscape, but reimagines it as an Ontario subject taking place on land that Watson knew intimately well. This is one of the reasons why I have come to the conclusion that the nearly 400-foot-long frieze in Watson's studio can be read as being as much a declaration of his independence as a Canadian artist painting Canadian scenery as it is a tribute to his favorite European painters. Watson's richly atmospheric paintings of Canadian scenery found a ready market in Montreal. It was there, beginning in the 1880s, that the collector and patron Charles Porteous promoted Watson's art to collectors such as James Ross, R.B. Angus, William Van Horn, George Haig, George Drummond, and Lord Strathcona. Elsewhere, though, Watson's market was a lot less robust. His Toronto dealer, John Payne, advised him to acknowledge this financial reality by painting smaller, less expensive canvases. Payne even recommended changes in color, in composition, in detail, and theme in order to make the paintings more palatable to Toronto audiences. A 1920 exhibition at Toronto's Jenkins Art Gallery was a success. Half of the 100 paintings there found purchasers, but they were all quite small. And in addition, but 1920 was also the year in which the Group of Seven and the Beaver Hall Group were founded, and Watson's attractiveness declined as his art fell increasingly out of step with the modernism practiced by the artists of those two groups. To make matters worse, the Great Depression wiped out most of Watson's financial investments, as well as the purchasing power of his major patrons, most of whom in any case had died or were dying of old age by the late 20s. It therefore made sense for Watson to take a more active role in reaching out to new buyers. It's not exactly clear from the surviving documentation whether the extension that he built onto his house in 1893 had originally functioned as a studio for making art, or whether it was always intended by him to be a large room in which he could display the work he had already produced in the original 1882 studio. But in any case, we do know that by the 1920s, he had already for several years been using the extension as a studio gallery, and that he was making regular practice of welcoming guests and potential patrons into it. And one can see that in this ground floor, because not only does it have ample walls for hanging paintings, it also has seating for visitors, a fireplace to make it more comfortable, and lighting arranged over the central picture gallery. And here is Watson, probably in about 1910, I think, standing in the studio gallery. By at least the 1920s, therefore, and probably in earlier years as well, this 1893 extension was functioning as a well-appointed sales room. Although little documentation about the studio sales survive, they seem to have been an important source of income for Watson as the 1920s and 1930s progressed. And that trend was bolstered in 1923 when Watson, at the age of 68, acquired his first automobile. As a result, for the first time in his long career, he was able to take heavy painting equipment like canvases, wood panels, multiple tubes of paint outside of the studio and into the landscape. In earlier years, he had made small plein air sketches and studies that he had later transformed into finished canvases in the studio. But as a result of the freedom he enjoyed because of his automobile, his final years saw him switch to doing extensive plein air painting and to spending less and less time working in the studio. Homer Watson died in 1936. After his death, his devoted sister Phoebe died in 1947, and the house and studio were purchased by his friends Ross and Bess Hamilton, who in 1948 established the Doon School of Fine Arts on the property. Some 200 students studied there annually under such well-known instructors as Fred Varley, Dorothy Stevens, and Charles Comfort, and the studio found a new life as an exhibition space for the students' work. Financial problems forced the closure of the school in 1966, but the house, studio, outbuildings, and land were all sold 3 years later in 1969 to another couple who then continued to offer art classes as well as tours of the house and the studio until 1975. The property, including the studio, was subsequently reincarnated as the Homer Watson House and Gallery, a museum and community center that hosts a program of art classes, lectures, and miscellaneous events to this day. These events included annual exhibitions of work that had been produced by Homer Watson. This is from a major show that they did about 5 years ago, as well as by contemporary artists from the Kitchener-Waterloo region and Ontario in general. Today, 87 years after Homer Watson's death and 141 years after he established his studio, that same studio and the associated gallery continues to be a venue for making, exhibiting, and promoting art. Thank you.